All right, everybody, welcome into our first lecture. Today we're going to go over some of the background information around first aid, what it's for, who it helps, those sorts of things. Before we get started, I just want to let you guys know these lectures are going to go kind of fast. It's not like a regular class where I have to stop and wait for you guys to take notes. So um, that is going to be up to you guys. However you decide to take notes, you guys will be required to pause the video, write down anything you need to write down, and then play the video. That is kind of the flexibility you have behind an online class like this and what makes it nice. All right, so first aid is important for a myriad of reasons, but first and foremost, it's there to serve you and all those around you. It's better to know first aid and know the basics of how to care for certain ailments than not. When you do need it, it can be really life-changing and can really prevent a lot of emergencies from becoming worse. But as a first aid provider, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get going, you're not there to diagnose any sort of injury. As a first aid provider, all we do is assess the issue and do the best that we can to take care of it. But we don't diagnose what exactly the problem is. We can make our best guess, but as far as officially stating what it is, that is above our pay grade. All we do is treat what we believe is happening. Okay? So, who needs first aid? The short answer is everybody. Okay? Unintentional and intentional injuries are considered the neglected epidemic. Basically, injuries in general are very, very common. And that's what first aid is for, is to be able to treat those things that seem minor but can really affect the quality of somebody's life. When talking about injuries in general and deciding who needs first aid, we kind of need to look at this injury pyramid. If you'll notice, the different tiers of the pyramid talk about the severity of injuries. The lowest tier and the biggest tier is injuries that we can treat as first aid providers. The next is injuries that need to be seen in an emergency department and urgent care or seen by a physician. The next is injuries that require a hospital stay, and the smallest portion are the ones that result in death. So as you'll notice, as first aid providers, most injuries, when we talk about, especially when we're talking about the commonality of injuries, the most common injuries can be treated by us as first aid providers. Okay. Now, there are certain injuries that are not, if not treated properly here, then move up the pyramid and can eventually become life-threatening. So that's another reason why we're very important. Every year, 1 in 4 people experiences a non-fatal injury that is serious enough to require medical care, or to at least restrict their activity for at least one day. So these injuries are very, very important. They're very important, very common, and so that's why we exist as first aid providers. Now, sports-related non-fatal injuries become they're very, very common, and they're treated in emergency departments more than any other type of unintentional injury, which is really why I have a job as an athletic trainer. The biggest part of my job is to assess injuries that our athletes undergo and then get them the type of care that they need. And most of the injuries that we see, we can take care of in-house in the athletic training room, but there are some that we have to refer out to doctors or other healthcare providers. But most of the things that we see, even in the athletics field, can be treated really by first aid providers. And really, as an athletic trainer, first aid is about 90% of what I do. a lot of the basic things to help prevent further problems from occurring, and take care of those immediate small things. Um, we'll talk more about this when we get into chapter 5, when we talk about CPR and those types of things. But death doesn't officially occur until a person's heart stops. Okay. Now, a bystander or a first aid provider, what we do can mean the difference between life and death, especially in these emergencies. Things that might require CPR or some intervention that we can do. Most injuries don't necessarily require life saving, right? Um, and that's why being a first aid provider is so valuable, and the knowledge that we hold is so valuable, because we're able to treat these things. So, more than just being valuable to those around you, first aid is very valuable for yourself. Um, there's a lot of times where in my life have undergone a certain injury, and because of the training I've received as a first aid provider, as an athletic trainer, I've been able to avoid a lot of healthcare costs. Things that maybe before I have the knowledge that I had, the knowledge that I do now, uh, I may have gone to the emergency room or gone to the doctor for. Now I really can treat it by myself. Um, and so as far as cost goes, this is a major plus. Um, it does also allow you to direct others to get the proper care if they need it. There are a lot of injuries that I see as an athletic trainer that, you know, we could send them to see their primary care doctor, just their family doctor, but really an orthopedic surgeon or an orthopedic trained doctor is going to have way more experience to deal with. And so as a first aid provider, we can kind of notice the types of injuries that people um, get as well, and help direct them to the best care for them. As first aid providers, we're also able to have a greater sense of awareness when it comes to certain activities, and it helps us to see things from a different perspective than somebody who doesn't have our training. Be able to notice those times where maybe we should do this a little bit differently to prevent this type of injury. Okay. And we've talked about a little bit about the value of first aid to others, especially family members, and those around you. This can be a great value to them. They may not have the same training, and so being able to go to them and help them can be very important. I get calls all the time from family members about, ailments or injuries that they have, and because of my training, I'm able to help them get the care that they need. Um, First aid is especially important in remote areas. Um, Here in Ephraim, we are somewhat considered a remote area because we don't have a hospital in town. We have to go out of town even just to get to a hospital. And so, with many, especially serious injuries, timing is so important. And so, having the knowledge to know, oh, I need to call 911 for this injury, because this person needs an ambulance, versus this person may not need to be transported by an ambulance. We do need to get them care right away, but I can transport them safely. Or even an ambulance may not arrive in time to be able to get this person the care that they need. Here in Ephraim, for example, our average response time for EMS is about 8 minutes. This last year, we had an experience with an athlete who actually had a stroke, and we were really concerned about him. He wasn't in a ton of distress, but we also knew that, it was probably safely to transport him in a personal vehicle rather than by ambulance. So we elected to just drive him to the hospital in Mount Pleasant rather than call 911. And really, in reality, we estimated we probably saved about at least 15 minutes of by the time the ambulance got there and they did an evaluation, so they knew what they were dealing with, and then transported our athlete to the hospital. That could have been time lost, and with strokes especially, timing is so important to prevent lasting damage. And so that that was a very good example to me of when it was appropriate to call 911 and when it wasn't necessarily appropriate. So knowing first aid and being able to make decisions in those remote areas especially can become very important. So this is a quiz question. Make sure you put a star by this because it's going to be on the chapter 1 quiz. I'll do this throughout all of these video lectures. I will let you guys know when there's something you guys need to write down and you need to understand well. Okay. So as a first aid provider, we have 4 goals. The first one, our first goal is to preserve life. We want to help the person continue to live. We want to alleviate suffering to the best of our ability, try and relieve pain and diminish pain. Next, we are trying to prevent further injury from occurring. So hopefully our care will stop any of the worsening of certain symptoms when we provide that care. And then last but not least, we try to promote recovery. Help this person be able to recover the best they can to get back to full health. Okay, so first aid competency. So these are some things that you should be able to learn by the end of this class. First and foremost, you should be able to recognize, assess, and prioritize times where first aid is needed. Next, you should actually be able to provide that care. Provide basic first aid. You should have the appropriate knowledge and the skills to be able to help these people and to be able to provide first aid. And then last but not least, you should be able to recognize your limitations and know when to seek out additional care. Long story short, I like to call this one stay in your lane. Being able to see these are the things that I can do, these are the things that are above my pay grade and what I need to get additional help for. Okay. The definition of first aid. So this first statement right here is a quiz question. This is the definition of first aid. First aid is helping behaviors and initial care provided for an acute illness or injury. It's what we do as initial care for acute illnesses or injuries are those types of injuries that have a rapid onset. This is like something like tripping and falling and scraping your knee, right? Like you know when that happened. Whereas chronic illnesses are illnesses that take place over a long period of time. This would be like somebody with type 2 diabetes, right? Over time, their weight increased, their health diminished to the point where their body was no longer able to produce insulin. That's a chronic illness, okay? But we do need to know when it comes to first aid, the first aid does not take the place of professional medical care, the proper professional medical care. Just because we're able to do first aid doesn't mean that we're able to do everything and does not eliminate the need for a lot of people to see and seek out further medical care. All right, now we're going to dive into a little bit of the legal aspects of first aid. This is really important. Believe it or not, as a first aid provider, you can be sued. Okay, but the risk can be minimized based on what you do. The ways to minimize your risk are first and foremost to obtain the person's consent, to explain what you're planning on doing to help this person, and then obtaining their consent to do it. Don't just perform a first aid skill without asking, even if it's the right thing to do. Next, follow the guidelines that we teach you in this class. There will be certain things and certain ways to do things, and you need to follow those guidelines. Next, stay in your lane. Don't exceed your training level. Don't try and do something that you've not been trained to do. I am not going to train you how to give somebody vaccines. You should never give somebody a vaccination as a first aid provider. That's outside of your pay grade. That's above your pay grade, outside of your lane. Okay. Next, part of consent is explaining the first aid you're going to give and why, right? This helps person understand that what you're doing is actually going to help them and not harm them. Treat everybody with respect. Be a good person. Don't be a jerk. Understand that people are people and do your best to help those people. And then once you've started to care for somebody, you need to stay with that person. And we'll talk about the legal term for this here in a minute. But this is just kind of an overview of ways to minimize your legal risk as a first aid provider. First, when talking about consent, you must have the person's permission before you give them, before you provide care for somebody, before you do anything to anybody. Touching somebody without their consent is a crime. It's called battery. And you can go to jail if you do this. So you do have to be really careful in what you're doing. The information on this slide is part of a quiz question. It's not word for word in the quiz, but make sure you understand this idea of consent for when you're ready to take the quiz. So the first type of consent we'll talk about is informed consent or expressed consent. Every legal adult, okay, you have to get consent from, as long as they're responsive, mentally competent, and they're of legal age, so they're 18 or older, okay? That is a quiz question. Make sure you understand that, okay? If they don't meet all of those parameters, then consent is different, and we're going to talk about that. As far as expressed consent, so somebody telling you, yes, I consent to you doing this, a nod of the head or saying yes or uh-huh, those are considered acceptable, okay? The next type of consent is what's called implied consent, okay? This is the type of consent where somebody is unresponsive, okay? So if somebody is unresponsive and they're a legal adult, they are typically a competent person, it is assumed that they would consent to life-saving interventions, okay? So just because somebody has goes into cardiac arrest and their heart stops, just because they can't talk to you and say, hey, please do CPR on me, doesn't mean you wouldn't do it, okay? You should do it because implied consent will cover you in this situation, okay? Also, part of implied consent, if there is an alert person who doesn't resist your first aid care, then that is also implied consent. So, for example, you explain what you're going to do, you ask them if you can do it, and they don't respond. So you begin treatment, and they don't say no, then that is considered implied consent. All right. Now, when it comes to consent for children and mentally incompetent adults, so children meaning under the age of 18. If you are trying to treat a child or somebody who is not a legal adult, you must obtain consent from their parent or legal guardian, okay? That also goes for those who are mentally incompetent. So somebody who has Down syndrome, or they have a mental illness to the point where they can't consent, or they don't understand, then you must also obtain consent from their parent or legal guardian, okay? If there is a life-threatening situation that does exist and a parent or guardian is not present, then implied consent takes takes precedence there, and you're able to provide care under the implied consent umbrella. Okay, so you would be protected. All right. As far as consent goes, a police officer is really the only person who has the legal authority to restrain somebody against their will. If you do come into a situation where somebody is being violent or somebody is resisting first aid care, and they're, especially if they're mentally incompetent, you're really only allowed to intervene when a police officer directs you to, or it's obvious that somebody's going to do something life threatening. So if somebody is coming at somebody with a knife and they are threatening them and those types of things, it is obvious that that person may do something life threatening, and you are legally able to intervene in those situations. Okay, so if by some chance somebody who is alert and mentally competent and of legal age, so they're an adult, and they refuse your help, what you should do is you should explain the condition to their person and what you are intending to do and why you would do it. Okay? Really be insistent. It's okay to be persuasive. Like, it's not against the law to try and be persuasive and trying to explain to the person, look, if I don't do something about this, you may die. This may impair you for the rest of your life. All those types of things. That's not against the law. Okay? Also, you're going to want to call 911 in those situations. You may have to involve authorities to be able to, protect yourself as well. If possible, make sure you have witnesses that the person refused care. And again, as well as calling 911, it may also be necessary to call law enforcement and have them assist you. All right, abandonment. So, this is a quiz question. Put a star by it. Abandonment is the legal term for leaving somebody once you have begun their care. So when we go back to the slide where we talked about the general things we can do to avoid legal trouble as a first aid provider, this was the last one, right? Once you have begun to perform care for somebody who is injured or ill, and they still need more care, if you leave that person, it's considered abandonment, and you can get sued for that. You would be legally liable for that. At least until another competent and trained individual takes responsibility for that person. Once EMS arrives or a family member who is first aid trained shows up and they say, hey, I've got care for this person, you're good, then you are legally allowed to leave. Till then, you are not. Okay? That's a quiz question. So next, we're going to talk about what's called negligence. Okay, now negligence is kind of a broad term, and so we're going to break it down a little bit further. But negligence in and of itself is a failure to follow the accepted standards of care for a given injury or illness that results in further injury to the person. Okay? So, in order for negligence to occur, you have to have a duty to act. Okay? So a duty to act is when you are legally required to provide care for somebody. And there's a few situations that would require that. First of all, if you are being paid and designated by your employer, and you're called to an injury scene, that is a duty to act. So you legally have to care for that person. Okay? If you're licensed by your state and your state requires you to act, regardless of whether you're on or off duty, that's a duty to act. For example, EMTs are required to act whether they're on or off duty if they come upon an emergency. That's a part of their license as EMTs. Okay. Me as an athletic trainer, whether I'm technically on or off the clock, at Snow College, if an athlete becomes injured, there is some sort of an emergency and they need care right now, and I get a call, I have to go regardless. Okay. So yeah, that's where the duty to act exists. If you do have a pre-existing relationship with that person and you have the training, you are also required to act to take care of that person as your duty to act. Talking more about duty to act, there are different standards of care that apply to different types of first aid providers. So for example, my training as an athletic trainer, okay, is higher than your standard first aid training. So my standard of care for certain injuries is different than a first aid provider's in your guys'. So the way I treat heat illness is different than you guys. For example, part of the standard of care as athletic trainers is if there is a suspected heat illness going on, so if I suspect somebody is having heat stroke, I have to get a rectal temperature of that person. I have to use a thermometer and put it up their rectum to get an accurate body temperature. If I don't, and that person dies or has a life-altering situation as a result, I'm liable for that, and I can get sued, and I could lose my license. So that's just an example of standards of care. Okay, and emergency care related organizations and societies different societies will publish like the recommendations for procedures. Who you are certified by as a first aid provider determines your standard of care. So all the information that I give you determines your standard of care as a first aid provider. If I get certified by the Red Cross, their recommendations become your standard of care. So on and so forth. For the most part, it's all pretty much the same. There are some minor differences and nuances between a lot of these organizations, but in general, most of them are the same. Okay, now, as far as not performing something when the duty to act is present, okay, there are two types of breach of duty. That's what breach of duty is if there is a duty to act and you don't fulfill that duty to act, then it's called breach of duty. Now, there are two types of breach of duty, and these are part of a quiz question. Make sure you understand that. So the first type of breach of duty is called an act of omission. Okay? An act of omission is not doing what you should have done. Okay, so I, as a first aid provider, in my training, I was taught that every time somebody has a diabetic emergency, I should give them sugar. But instead, I gave them salt. Actually, that's incorrect. Every time somebody has a diabetic emergency, I'm supposed to give them sugar, but I didn't give them anything. That is called an act of omission. I didn't do what I should have done. Okay? So somebody with similar somebody who is what a reasonably prudent or somebody who is competent that has the same training or similar training that is in similar circumstances would do. Not doing that is called an act of omission. Okay? The next type of breach of duty is called an act of commission. So an act of commission is doing something that a reasonably prudent person with the same or similar training in similar circumstances would not have done. So, doing something that you shouldn't have done. For example, if I go in and, so take my previous example, somebody is having a diabetic emergency and I give them salt instead of sugar. So I should have given them sugar, but instead I gave them salt. So I did the wrong thing. Okay? All right. So if you are found to be guilty of negligence in any form, okay, you could be liable if there are injury and damages inflicted. Those could be physical damage, physical pain and suffering, mental anguish, any medical expenses that were incurred as a result, and any loss of earnings or the ability to work to make a living. You could be held liable for all of those things. Okay. So we've talked about a lot of scary stuff, and here in a minute we're going to get into the protections that we do have. Okay. So um, as a first aid provider, you should not exceed your skill level. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. You have to stay in your lane. We're going to watch a little bit of a funny video to kind of examine a situation like this. If anybody's seen the movie The Heat, this is one of my favorite scenes from that movie. It's pretty funny. We're going to talk about what Sandra Bullock's character does in this situation and how she could be liable for the damages incurred. Anyway, we're going to stop there. Basically, what she's doing, she's like, oh, well, I watched some YouTube videos and I have decided I know how to do an emergency tracheotomy to help this person breathe that can't breathe. She is way outside of her training level. She just decided that she knew how to do this from watching some YouTube videos. This is trying to exceed your skill level. She could be liable for an act of commission as far as breach of duty is. As a police officer, she has a duty to act to provide the care that she knows how to provide, but she tried to do too much. And so she would be guilty of an act of commission in this situation. All right. The next thing when talking about providing care, you are required as a first aid provider to be confidential with medical information. You're only allowed to discuss medical information with those that have a medical need to know. Doctors, when you hand over care of this person to EMS or medical personnel that arrive on the scene, they have a medical need to know. You are okay to share medical information with them, but not with just anybody. Okay. That law is called HIPAA. It stands for Health Information Portability and Accountability Act. Okay. Now, this next part is a quiz question. There are a few situations that, no matter what, as a first aid provider, you are required to report to law enforcement personnel. And these are rape, abuse, and gunshot wounds. Those three situations require you to report. Okay. So we talked about all these scary things where you could be held legally liable for certain things. Now we're going to talk about the protections that have been provided for you as a first aid provider. Okay. These are called Good Samaritan laws. These laws are there to encourage people to assist others and protect you as a rescuer, as a first aid provider, when you are acting during an emergency, acting in good faith, having good intentions, when you're not being paid. So these don't apply if you're being paid. Okay, so for me, as an athletic trainer, Good Samaritan laws don't apply when I'm treating a snow college athlete. Okay. And also, if you're not guilty of malicious misconduct, or gross negligence towards the person. So if you don't do something really bad and you're doing the best you can, you're not being paid, and you're acting in an emergency, then Good Samaritan laws would protect you. Okay. Reasons you would not be protected by a Good Samaritan law is if you've caused further injury to the person, if you've given really poor first aid, or if you've exceeded your scope of training. So again, Sandra Bullock's character in that video would not have been protected because she exceeded her scope of training. All right, so those are the legal aspects of first aid. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about are some techniques you can use to prevent injury as a first aid provider. So it's easier to prevent an injury than it is to try and treat one, right? Some different an acronym or a thing to remember to help you when preventing injuries is effective prevention uses the 3 E's: education, enforcement, and engineering. Okay, so some examples of these. Education would be things like swimming lessons, a gun safety course, maybe a social media clip showing a procedure for safety, or alerts about the weather for road conditions, things like that. Those are like helping people know how to prevent emergencies, right? Swimming lessons helps prevent drowning. Gun safety course helps prevent accidental shootings. Those types of things. Okay, the next type is enforcement. Enforcement is like laws. There are laws in place to help us to be safe. Probably the best one is the seatbelt law, right? Like wearing a seatbelt's inconvenient, nobody likes it, but it is there to prevent a first aid emergency, right? Most of the time, the only thing it would hurt is you if you don't wear a seatbelt. There are other circumstances, but for the most part, it's really only going to hurt you. But it has become a law because it's been decided that that is for your safety. And last but not least is engineering. The way things are made are really to help prevent injuries. Helmets have only been made for injury prevention. That's the only thing they're good for, really. Like, we're not just wearing a helmet to look cool, we're wearing a helmet to protect ourselves. Okay. Airbags in cars, if not used correctly, they can actually be dangerous. But if they are used correctly, they are very good at preventing certain injuries. Those are just a few examples of injury prevention. And us as first aid providers can continue to use these things to help us and those around us to be safe. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 1. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Go in and get chapter 1 quiz taken, and you'll be good to go to get started on chapter 2. Thanks.